Okay, looks like it's streaming live now. So I'd like to call the meeting to order as of 4:02 p.m. And we'll start off with the land acknowledgement. And Glynis, I believe you're up.
Yep, thank you. So we're holding this meeting virtually, but as a committee of the town of Canmore, located within Treaty 7 area of Southern Alberta. And I'd like to echo the town's land acknowledgement by noting that the area is the traditional territory of the Yarti Nakota, which includes the Bearspaw First Nation, Chiniki First Nation, and the Wesley First Nation, as well as the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Blackfoot Confederacy, which includes the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai. And this territory is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And we acknowledge all nations who live, work, and play and help us steward this land and honor and celebrate this territory. And we commit to working to live in right relations and to advance truth and reconciliation. And I'll just add that today's land acknowledgement is particularly important because tomorrow, June 21st, is National Indigenous Peoples Day, a day to recognize and celebrate the unique heritage and diverse cultures and outstanding contributions of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. And in the Canmore context, I would like to salute the connection to the land and the stewardship of the land that is lived by our Indigenous inhabitants and neighbors. Thanks.
Thanks, Glynis. Now we have to assign the land acknowledgement for the next meeting, which probably won't be till September, but maybe assign it anyways. Looks like Kevin put his hand up, but not his voice.
Sorry about that. All done. Yes. Yes,
Okay.
I volunteer.
All right. Thanks, Kevin.
Apologize.
Okay. Let's have a look at the meeting minutes, and let's anybody wishes to amend the agenda or do we go ahead with approval of the agenda for today's meeting? Could I get a motion to approve the agenda? Thanks, Jeff. Anybody seconder? Thanks, Ralph. All in favor? Approval of the minutes from the May 30th meeting. Has everybody had a chance to review those and submitted their comments previously? Okay, could I get a motion to approve the minutes of the May 30th meeting? Thanks, Ken. A seconder. Thanks, Glynis. All in favor? It's carried. And now unfinished business. Caitlin, could you give us a bit of an update on the unfinished business items?
Certainly. So a few of them are sort of lingering from the May 5th meeting. So Caitlin Miller and myself had some discussions recently about education and around wildlife in the form of brochures or pamphlets or whatever that might look like. We talked about potentially veterinary in clinics, etc., for visitors to come, the visitors to the Bow Valley. So we sent an email to Nick today, actually, about potentially working with the Biosphere on this, or getting some information on the Biosphere on previous kind of education that they've done, so that we're not trying to duplicate the same work that's already been done. So we will continue to work on that and move through that. The next thing was information from parks on where pets are on leash. So we do have a map that GIS pulled together for us of where all of our off-leash signage is within the town. So I will attach that when I send out the meeting minutes. It's pretty hard to see on a screen, so I'll just attach it for everyone to look at. And Parks wanted us to know that they don't think that is the most up-to-date inventory. So this winter they plan to do an inventory and make sure that they are capturing all signage on that layer on our GIS for that map. So more to come on that one as well. On I am still waiting on a bit more background on the Quarry Lake, the two parks and the connection between the two being off leash and on leash. So once that comes in, I'll share that as well. And then there was a question about the removal, why we're looking at the removal of fruit trees versus having volunteers remove the fruit. So similar to kind of what we expressed before, is that's really a resourcing issue. And we want to ensure that we're leading by example. So that's why those trees had been removed on town property initially. And then there was a request to do a tour of a wildfire management, some of the wildfire management work that had been completed. So I reached out to our fire services department. They are available to give a tour if the group would like to do that. So as a group, we just need to decide sort of when we'd want to do that. And then I would bring that back to fire services to see if we can match up some times and dates. But there definitely is interest to show the group the work that's been done there. And then the last thing was Waverly brought it up about a future discussion around cigarette butts. And so that would be just another conversation to potentially have today to put on the agenda for a future meeting. And that was it for me for outstanding items. So back over to you, Bob.
Just one question, Caitlin. Are you confirming that all the fruit trees have now been removed from town property, or?
No, there's still 5 left downtown on official town property that still need to be removed, and will be, the Parks Department will work towards that as the budget is remaining budget this year. So I can report back, I guess, in the fall how progress happened with that. But there was a question, and I can't remember who exactly asked it at the last meeting, about why are we removing fruit trees on town property versus having a volunteer committee pick the fruit.
Right. Okay, thanks. I guess we can now move on to our feature presentation of the meeting. Caitlin, would you like to introduce Brett?
Sure. So Brett Buchal with Alberta Environment and Parks is here today, and his colleague John Pekowski, sorry if I butchered that, John. Yes, thank you. Is here to support him as well and to listen in. Both work for Alberta Environment Parks in the human wildlife coexistence realm. And we, as in earlier discussions as ERC, wanted to get a bit more information on what the province's role is with wildlife management versus what the town's role is, and how can we be supporting each other. And so ERC is really looking for information from Alberta Environment so that they can make recommendations to the Town of Canmore Council at a later date. And so Brett and John have both graciously agreed to be here. I believe Brett will be leading the presentation for the most part, and we can open it for question and answer at the end. And then Brett and John will probably step off the call and we can continue the meeting at that point. So I will hand it over to Brett.
Okay. Hi, everyone, and thank you. First off, let me say thank you to John, because I think this kind of came upon him like, whoa, what's happening? So thanks for being here, John. And how I'll bring up my presentation in a second, but how I've structured it is we being myself and Mark Hoskin, who's a district officer, Fish and Wildlife Enforcement Officer, responsible for Canmore. We're in a meeting with Caitlin and as well as Greg Burke. Did I get, yes. And we were just discussing, and there was some confusion, I think, from Caitlin and others about what do officers do, what does a biologist do, and then this idea of ERC came up, and Caitlin said, hey, could you please present? And so Caitlin asked a bunch of questions, and I've kind of structured my presentation around those questions. And sorry, John, I wasn't able to get this. I just sent this to Caitlin about an hour ago, so I didn't send it out. So you'll be seeing it as everyone else is.
Fresh, thank you.
And my PowerPoint is not working now, of course. Let me try that again. Sorry about that. Always technical difficulties whenever you do this, right?
No worries. If you do get stuck, I have it pulled up here as well, so I can try to share it from my screen if it doesn't work for you.
Yeah, no problem. It was just apparently running in the background the whole time I was talking. So, whoops, we'll try again. Can everyone see the opening screen? Perfect. Thank you very much, Bob.
We're seeing your presenter view though. Your
So I think if you go to display settings at the top, you can switch your screens. That might help.
I'm not as good at Zoom anymore. I've been working in, is that better?
Yes, looks perfect.
Perfect. Thank you, John. So these were for the agenda, more or less how I structured this is these were the questions that were asked of at the time, myself and Mark, about what are your roles? What is the department responsible for? What are your duties when it comes to wildlife management? What are some trends? Admittedly, I didn't get as much into the trends just based on timing, but in my mind, because John hasn't seen this before, what are some of the gaps and weak points? And what are some of the #1 issues that perhaps IRC could focus on? And what's next for our department? The one piece I'll maybe ask is, as I'm going through this, I know, Caitlin, you mentioned, save questions for the end, but we can totally do that. But it might be worthwhile just having a little bit more fluid discussion as it works for people to say, hey, I have a question about point X, and we can go through that.
That sounds great.
So the Bow Valley, where everyone should probably know the Bow Valley. This actually slide came from some of the work that, as an example, myself and John were involved in regards to the roundtable. And this is what the Bow Valley was more or less defined as, extending from the Castle Mountain downstream of the Bow River till we get to the Stony Reserve. And of course, within that, you have the town of Canmore, where you have a lot of developed area in the middle, and then you have lots of outskirts that are undeveloped for various reasons. Now, the reason I wanted to bring up this slide is this is the Bow Crow district that I'm responsible for. And this little piece right here is the area I just showed in the map. So it's a small chunk of the land that I'm responsible for in wildlife management throughout this area. And I only do this just to provide a little bit of context as as we go through and say, well, what about this? And it's like, absolutely maybe, but there might be some resource constraints, at least placed on my side. So Canmore is a myriad of jurisdictions. And so the fact that John's here from Parks, and we also had Mark Hoskin from Fish and Wildlife Enforcement. So what can I say? And I don't think when I say any of this, it should be new to anyone, I hope. But Canmore is a former mining town. Largely, that's what Canmorites used to call themselves, right? They're all former miners if you lived here in the late 70s. Adjacent to and overlaps with provincial parks. There's lots of town land and parkland that might be on the same parcel. Larch Island as an example. It's a very desirable mountain and resort community. One of the tourist destinations in Alberta. And it's a recreational training ground like Olympic hopefuls. And in fact, Olympic Games were once held here, and there was thought that maybe they should be again. That's not there. And I put at the end, it's one of the leading grounds in the province for wildlife movement and corridors. Once again, I don't think this is news to anyone here, but this is what Canmore is or can be. And a lot of, like, going back to the roundtable, some of what we did was having our cake and eating it too. So it's a multi-jurisdictional area. And like I said, it's a recreational paradise. It's a mountain home or your second home. for those who might live elsewhere. It's an opportunity to get in touch with nature. It's where Olympic dreams are made, or at least the training for those are occurring. And at the same time, it's a wildlife preserve, or in many minds, it can be a wildlife preserve as well. But what does this mean for wildlife? So there's a whole bunch of very much competing interests. And what we've found is that wildlife face a mixture of encounters, responses, and landscapes as they move in and around Canmore. In, of course, going back a few years, but we had wildlife corridors that were set up. And, you know, the idea at the time, admittedly, I wasn't here at the time, but was to say, hey, let's set up a bunch of wildlife areas where we can set aside parts for wildlife to move around. There was kind of a recognition that Canmore was a busy part. This came out largely out of a Three Sisters decision in 1992, and years negotiating up to that, kind of the first rendition of corridors occurred. And that allowed, but at the same time, in some of those corridors, we've put a dog park right beside one. We've have that Olympic training ground. We have residential homes right beside another. So once again, it creates that uncertainty of how to manage for wildlife. And I put up this wildlife, a snapshot of the wildlife coexistence, because this is a lot of what we were working with a few years ago to say, hey, how can we work better for consistency in our actions when we're dealing with wildlife, as well as improving the public understanding of what our responses are or will be. So I've kind of explained some of the confusion that wildlife might have. And now to Caitlin's initial question, well, how does it all work with everyone in the government, all this big Alberta Environment and Parks Department? So AEP, and I took this right from our website, John, if you're wondering, we support environmental conservation, protection, sustainable economic prosperity, quality of life, and outdoor recreation opportunities. That's a mouthful. I'm only responsible for a very small chunk of that, and admittedly I have to figure out what it is. But so who's in AAP? We have lands for our public lands management. We have parks who are managing parks operations. There's water. There's stewardship, to which I'm a part of, so fish and wildlife. There's air, and there's now a recreation side, which is managing it. So our department has many, many facets of what we're managing for. Largely, it's for that environmental conservation and protection, with figuring out what the opportunities are that kind of align with those goals. Fish and wildlife enforcement perform two functions. So they help conserve and protect our natural resources through ensuring everyone understands and complies with the laws. So this is the enforcement piece. So in going through, when I was able to actually get some of the data and I went through, there were 3,000 reports of occurrences over the last 3 years. 2,000 of them related to fisheries infractions. So there's a lot of work, as an example, making sure that your fishermen and hunters follow the law. Admittedly, in and around Canmore, there's less hunting, but that's one of the big things that they do, is the enforcement piece. And then the second piece is they ensure public safety and protection of property in regards to wildlife. So this is the wildlife conflict piece. So on there, typically, if there is a bear rooting around in your shed, that's a call to Fish and Wildlife, and they come and assess and figure out what's the next best possible decision to make relative to that bear. And this is actually a part where, John, you know, I'd like you to maybe weigh in here, but generally speaking, Fish and Wildlife enforcement are going to manage these wildlife conflict issues on private and Crown land, so non-park land, whereas the conservation officers are managing the same issues on the parks land base. John, would you more or less agree with that statement? You're muted. Sorry, John.
As you mentioned before, Brad, it's a complicated mosaic. So the conservation officers do cross those jurisdictional lines, and yeah, hopefully we work to support one another. But that's That is correct, what you just
Yep.
said, but I think there's room and potential for even more collaboration and supporting one another.
Agreed. I guess at the letter of the law, that's kind of how it goes, but in the multi-jurisdiction area that is the town of Canmore, there's probably going to be a lot more job sharing, so to speak. So who's responsible for what? And this is a difficult one. So AEP, wildlife management, we typically manage wildlife for the benefit of people. Now, what that benefit is really depends on who's looking. So in some case, that's a hunter in terms of how we're allocating our harvest. So for deer, elk. In some cases, that might be the prevention of damage. So we work to prevent the damage before it occurs, or the conflict before it occurs. And that's something we work quite closely with municipalities and WildSmart on. Additionally, we do a lot of permitting for disturbance. So if there is a research, if we need to collar a bear, we need to permit that, versus maybe there's something that needs to be taken care of on private land, we might permit the take of that animal as well. What is the role of the municipalities, in particular towns? Well, largely you're managing bylaws to prevent and manage issues within your own boundaries. However, this does include a role in managing the habitat as well as public safety. So a recent example might be hunting on Larch Island. There, for a long time, there has been archery harvest allowed, once again, because of this jurisdictional interplay where you have both town land and wildland park on the same parcel of land. And because the provincial legislation would override the town legislation, would be, even though the town says, well, we don't want hunting, or you can't hunt, which actually becomes outside of the town boundaries about what their bylaw can say. But the Parks Act says that you can hunt, so therefore that's why hunting was allowed. So what the town said is that we're worried about this becoming a safety issue. So we said, okay, well then under the Municipal Government Act, you can say it's a town issue and it's a safety issue, and you can create a bylaw that can restrict the discharge of firearms for the purposes of safety. So once again, that's just an example, I guess a real life example from Canmore about how issues can be managed within the town. Now, Fish and Wildlife Enforcement, and this is more specific, acknowledging that there will be some go-between, as John said earlier, between conservation officers and fish and wildlife officers, is they may manage conflict species to maintain public safety. Now, typically, this is going to be involved in managing public safety from large, sometimes dangerous critters. So bears and elk and other ungulates in some respects, assuming those animals can be identified. However, they typically don't manage species to which there are either considered nuisance wildlife or pests, like skunks, or that can be managed by the urban municipality itself, so the town of Canmore. So for example, there's an exemption if there's coyote concerns. The officers may not address the coyote concerns because that's been exempted within the city to allow the towns to deal with it however they may see fit. So an example would be is that the city of Calgary has created a coyote management plan where prior to about 6 years ago, their first reaction was just to remove the coyote and then hire a trapper to do that. Now they have a hazing program. So where they work and they try to change the coyote's behavior prior to moving towards, I guess, the ultimate decision, which might be removal. And parks, once again, going back, largely works to minimize and manage wildlife conflict on parks land. And we're all working together to achieve the same objectives. And this is where, to John's point earlier, it becomes really important that we're all trying to work, because the town of Canmore is so finite that a bear leaving Canmore Nordic Center all of a sudden finds itself in Quarry Park, which is all of a sudden. And so we're all trying to work together and achieve the same goals at the end of the day. So when this came up, this question, I decided to focus my, and we could easily use coexistence instead of conflict, and coexistence might be more appropriate for this group. But what exactly is human wildlife conflict? Because that's where the issue. Coexistence is when everything's going well, and when things go sideways, of course, then there's a conflict exists. And the way that we've largely defined it is it involves either the exact risk or a potential risk, the risk or the consequence to people, property, and that requires a management response. So if a bear is walking by and it's in Quarry Lake, that might not be defined as a conflict. But if that bear now starts to move towards the actual Quarry Lake and away from the dog park, or approaches a dog, or approaches a person and a dog, now all of a sudden that might have a heightened risk, and now that might be defined now as a conflict upon which we might require an action. And in using that term, so our fish and wildlife officers record a lot of this. Here's some data I was able to gather. Now, I haven't been able to go through this in any fine detail. So some of these might be sightings. Some of these might be, heightened conflict. But as of right now, this is just kind of a really quick snapshot over the last 3 years. I wanted to get the last 3 years to kind of say, well, what did COVID do? And apparently COVID didn't do anything. And it was more a function of what the bears were doing, in particular black bears. And so you can see that black bears are largely the drivers of what I'm going to say conflict, or maybe lack of coexistence in and around the town of Canmore. Most of these were within the town. Some of these were on, for example, John, at Canmore Nordic Center, while others would have been within the MD itself, MD of Bighorn, so Harvey Heights. But largely black bears are the ones that are driving a lot of the trend here. And it varies from year to year. So in 2020, there was very little, but we saw that number was high in 2019 and higher again in 2021. This year isn't looking great either right now. But as I'm saying that, I think it's really important, and it's been in the news a lot, well, maybe not a lot, but it's definitely been in the news, is elk here shown in yellow. So we had about 35 cases in 2019. And in 2020, we saw about 58 cases, I want to say. That number dropped a little bit again in 2021, but that's something that's really becoming apparent, is our elk conflict is definitely rising. And it's something that, and we're seeing from about mid-May till about right now. Hopefully, as these cow calves start to go off on their own, they'll become less of an issue, but definitely something that's been generating a lot of attention. Jeff.
Thanks for the presentation there, Brett. So with regards to the elk side of things, is that because we're actually seeing a change in behavior amongst elk here in the Bow Valley? Like, is there sort of a different behavior set that they're taking on, or is there a different reason why? I'm just curious. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say that it's maybe a learned behavior that the elk have started to figure out. So there has been elk conflict for some time, but it tended to be, Engine Bridge, there was a cow elk getting pretty ornery and people left. So I think it's my take on it, because we haven't actually seen elk numbers change remarkably. At least we haven't been counting, for the record. It's difficult to survey within the town. We're working on that. But overall, it kind of seems that we haven't seen significant changes in elk population, but we have seen change in behavior. So I am wondering, and where I'm thinking is it's a little bit of both. One, we've had cows be very successful at maintaining themselves by being quite ornery. And so once you've learned that, it's a positive, like, hey, I can do this and I'm going to keep doing that. But on the same time, we might have more people using these areas that haven't been before, especially when you think about, and the reason I say that in 2020, and John, jump in if you have different thoughts, but in 2020, we had supposedly, we had a lot more people using areas close to them and using on trails and so that might have reduced the refugia that the elk were used to before, and that might have been partially responsible for that uptick, especially going from 2019 to 2020. So I think it's a combination of people and knowledge, and I think we're starting to work on that better, because really up to 2 years ago, I think we had very limited communication on elk. It was there, but I don't think we had as many media blitzes. John, I think it's really started in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and I was just talking to Mark Hoskin the other day, and he said he had almost in one day as many elk reports as he had, in most of last spring, and in
Yeah.
one day, and that urbanization of elk. Yeah, and I think exactly what you said is they're realizing people are a bit of a pushover. They're successful at having babies in yards and closer to town, and why wouldn't you carry on if that was working for you?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
And I think the other thing on the elk, that largely we're seeing all of our conflicts in the summer here, early summer. We're not seeing it during the rut as much. So we haven't had, many cases of a bull elk bowling everyone over, which is kind of interesting. I know in talking to Bill Hunt, former superintendent for Banff, not superintendent, resource manager for Banff, he was saying that when the Banff issues were really getting out of control, it was people running into bulls a lot at the start of it before the cows became an issue. So we're kind of seeing a little bit different, where we haven't had many bull issues so far, knock on wood. So where can we improve? And admittedly, Caitlin, I'm not exactly sure about how ERC operates, so I kind of defer to you. But as I was thinking about this, I think these aren't novel issues. Well, rather they've been repeating over time, and as Canmore grows, especially as people discover Canmore, so not just it grows in terms, but as people start to say, hey, Canmore is a place I want to come and visit. These issues occur over and over again, and I think going back, one of the key things we can do is we can look at the recommendations of the roundtable and see what we can do. And for the record, there's been a lot of really good things. I think the fact that, and I think I saw Gareth on the call earlier, Wild Smart outreach. Wild Smart is a leader in the whole idea of community outreach. And I think continuing to use them and supporting them helps get that message out. The fact that there's identified corridors and patches. There's a lot of communities that speak to having corridors and patches, but none of them have really been defined in the same way that Canmore has. Do we have to manage them? Absolutely. But I think Canmore is quite a bit ahead in a lot of regards in that area. Many mitigations are already in place. Attractant bylaws, you're just talking about the fruit tree. It is interesting, at least on the town land, that other jurisdictions are also following. So for example, Okotoks has a lot of deer issues, and they've moved to remove all their fruit trees on town land as well. And they are working, in similar minds. That's just to say, hey, we don't want to be that added piece that's going to allow deer to be here and just keep on and providing them an alternative food source. And of course, the attractant management. And some of the next slides I'm going to show are just kind of the how that has improved things in and around Canmore. So I believe it was 1999, Canmore had decided to put in a lot, and this is going, my colleague who just retired, Jay Honeyman, who I'm sure everyone's familiar with, can relate to this. But in 1999, Canmore put in limits to how garbage was managed in Canmore. And you can see in 2000, it went from like 60 to 10, right? And it's more or less just dropped off over this. And I only have this to 2016, but there are very few bear related. So those that it works. Wildlife collisions in regards to where fencing and of course underpasses to allow some movement has occurred. So this is looking at the area by Dead Man's Flat, so along the Three Sisters property where fencing was in place. Fencing put in 2004. This is typically before 2004. This is the number of vehicle collisions you'd see, and after. Transportation is looking to improve this. So once again, going a little bit outside of the Bow Valley, but moving this all the way to the Kananaskis River, there hopefully will be fencing in the near future. Jeff.
Thanks for the question, sir. With regards to, say, the highway traveling through Canmore, like, we had some anecdotal stuff, elk getting hit and stuff. This is a question for you and John. What do you think the best plan is for mitigating wildlife collisions on the highway right through the Canmore area right now? Like, yeah, like how do we move forward with some of that stuff?
I'll give you the
Like,
hard
that
answer.
means you got an answer for us, sir.
Yeah. Well, to be perfectly honest, it's difficult because what's occurred is that we've created really good conditions for elk to occur, especially on the medians of the road. So there's salt and there's grass first thing after the snow melt, right? It's probably one of the first areas to green up. So there's probably one or two things you could do. One would be to fence it and exclude the elk from that. Admittedly, that's not very aesthetic, but it could be done. The other would be removing the attractant that's on the road. So maybe working with transportation to say, we need to do something different, and maybe putting decorative gravel as an example along parts of the road. Now, I think it probably takes more time just sitting down, but just removing that grass. Typically, the idea is to grass everything, but if you graveled it, you may not see that. Now, how that cost would be shared, that's beyond my pay grade. But those are ways to limit the attractiveness to elk or prevent the elk from accessing those sites within the town of Canmore itself.
Okay, thank you.
Waverly?
Yeah, thank you. Curious here if you could tell us a bit about who's responsible for maintaining that fencing. And I'll give you a bit more context. I have a very specific question because I think I reported a gap in the fence near the Bow River, like just as you get to Three Sisters to, I guess I lived here for more than a year now. So it would have been over a year ago. And I talked to the town at the time, and this is just jogging my memory, but I reported it to whoever the contractor was, because that's who the town had said to go through, because it's provincial jurisdiction. But the gap's definitely still there, and I see elk coming through it.
Okay.
So I can send you a pin if that's in your purview, or if you're able to talk about the process for reports like that in maintenance. I think that would be great.
So I will say that there's probably not a good process, and John's probably lamented this many times, but there's not a good process for fixing wildlife fence. And that's namely because transportation, my understanding is that transportation put this up in concert with the G7 funding, I believe, but they didn't really have a great plan for how this would occur. And at the time, that was the first time that transportation had ever done anything like this. So the wildlife fencing, at least on the provincial side, was kind of a, sure, we'll put it up and we'll deal with it. It wasn't really thought to maintain it. As we maintain it now, what we try to do is we try to alert transportation staff, and then they'll try and go fix it. And I say try because they have many other things to do, and sometimes they get to it and sometimes they don't. And sometimes it takes us 3 months, and sometimes it might take us 3 years, unfortunately, to fix some of these things. But the appropriate thing to do, because it technically is their fence and they have to maintain it for a certain liability, would be to get transportation to fix it. So if you can maybe pass it on to me, I can pass it on to transportation. If we haven't already done it, I think this is a new one, John, if it's by the Bow River.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems in egresses and all over. We just had that one section finished by Stewart Creek, but transport basically came to me and said, we can either do it in the next 3 days or it'll happen in October. Yep. And that was kind of their window. So like Brett said, there's not a great mechanism, but we could do better.
You might have fixed this one. The email that I sent originally was through an account. I don't work there anymore, so I don't have access to that account. But I'll keep an eye out when I'm on the highway, and I can send you a pin if I see it's still open. So it's appreciated. Thank you.
And I will say, I think it's getting better in the last, actually, on the whole transportation piece is that transportation's actually acknowledged that there is a wildlife vehicle collision concern. Admittedly, it's from a public safety concern, but they are dedicating funding towards that. And in working with transportation, you know, they are identifying that it's not just a one-time thing and there needs to be maintenance as well. So this is what it's like now, but I am hoping that it will improve over time. So there are many good things that have occurred in the Bow Valley, and like I said, leaders in a lot of ways. However, I think it's important to recognize there's still a rubs. So one of the things, once again, quoting our very liberally quoting the roundtable recommendations, is that we're going to continue to work to manage people areas for people and wildlife areas for wildlife. And if you see this bottom screen here, those are elk locations, and that's a corridor. And we somehow have to encourage our elk to start using that corridor and less of the people areas. And, you know, going maybe back to Jeff's initial question about keeping elk off the highway, maybe by doing that too and improving the habitat further in these corridors will also maybe lessen the chance that there's going to be elk using all of the people areas as well. Once again, respect the wildlife and follow the rules. This came directly from our roundtable report as well, but I don't think this is unheard of to have us close an area and then have many people in said area that's closed. And then I use this last picture of the bears and the wildlife is that we need to find a balance, and we need to recognize that there are going to be trade-offs. So right now, this isn't very balanced. We need roads. Roads are for people to travel on. Then how do we manage for wildlife moving across that? So there's been a trade-off made to say, yeah, we're going to have a road here and we're going to have people. Now we need to come up with policy or strategies that prevent this and this turning into a very poor situation. So what is the future? Well, I think we have to, and sorry, John, I recognize that there's still, I'm still referencing Chaperdia and not Buffalo Berry, but we need to maintain our ongoing attractant removal within developed areas. So I think, you know, what ERC is moving forward with, the fruit tree, absolutely. And further the town, I would encourage the town to continue with removal of buffalo berry, especially within developed areas. There's no sense attracting a bear where we don't want that bear to be. So fruit trees, maybe we have to look and see where we want wildlife to be and where we prefer wildlife not to be. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is a silver bullet, but the fencing of some of our areas. So for example, Centennial Park was fenced. Yeah, there's still some elk incursions, but I think the decision was made that, hey, this is great. We may need to look at applying a similar tool in other areas or seeing if it's appropriate in other areas. I think the wildlife attractant bylaws have done a really good thing. Not only does it provide the town of Canmore with a little bit of a tool to flex, but also it's a great education, right? If people know, and sometimes communication alone may not do it, but having that added law to say, this isn't appropriate and we need to do something differently, I think helps out a lot and makes people understand how to manage their attractants. I think a really big piece is going back to one of my opening statements is managing the recreation. Admittedly, I don't live in Canmore, so I can't pretend that I'm there and recreating every day, but you know, everyone wants to recreate. But I think we have to recognize that there are going to be trade-offs and to recognize where it's okay to make those trade-offs and in some cases where it might be different. So in saying that, I think there's lots of opportunities to engage with the various recreation groups, and that might be something for ERC itself to be involved in. And when there are issues within the town, that's when we need to probably call, report a poacher or KS Environmental Hotline, so that those places to say, okay, there's now a bear in my backyard and it's causing grief. At the time, that's what needs to know, so that behavior can either be changed or the appropriate authorities can be involved in and make an assessment. So at the end, it's going to take in a community. I often use the term trade-offs, but I recognize trade-offs are never black and white. And it's going to take a community approach to get to whatever objective that Canmore wishes to achieve. And in saying this is, I'll quote John again, saying there's lots of opportunities to work together in Canmore. And I say this to everyone here, is there's a real opportunity to work together and figuring out what that objective is, and then figuring out what tools we can all implement to reach that objective. And which goes to the next point is there is going to be conflict with wildlife. I think largely that's going to be, to some extent, unavoidable in entirety, but we can put in together recommendations, and they offer the opportunity to enhance the coexistence that you can see in the Bow Valley. And lastly, we're here to help with questions and to even help with implementation. Once again, due to that myriad of land jurisdictions that we're all involved in. So we're here to help and work together. And then I'll leave it like that, and there's my contact.
Great, thanks, Brett. That was super informative and a lot of great information. And I just saw Jeff. Did you have a question? I saw your hand go up and come back down.
Yeah, are we having a bit of a question period time now? Is okay, cool. I didn't know if I was like, so is someone, this is a question for both for Jay and Brett. With Jay Honeyman retiring as the conflict biologist for larger animals, who will be stepping into his role moving forward that the town can look towards for help with these things?
In short, I don't know. It's not always easy to replace staff in the government, and it's been put forward, but as of yet, it hasn't been approved for recruitment at this time.
Okay.
So,
okay.
John, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I wasn't even sure there was the intent to fill that position, but I think, I work for Alberta Parks, and we have staff
Fingers crossed.
that manage bears in Kananaskis country, but Brett's got not only the town of Canmore, but southern Alberta to contend with, and having someone in a position to deal with those conflicts across that area just seems critical to me.
Yeah, that Bow Crow picture that you posted was a ginormous territory, right? So yeah, and Jay was a great resource. So it'd be great if that capacity could be maintained moving forward for everyone. Yeah.
And I do think there is intent. How it will transpire, I don't really know. I guess the only other thing to add is that Jay wasn't solely responsible for Canmore. He was lucky enough to live in Canmore, but his work extended from Sundre all the way south down to there. So he was often traveling to Pincher Creek and working with angry farmers as much as he was working with angry cyclists on Legacy Trail.
Yeah.
So
okay, thank you.
Gareth.
Hey, Brett, thanks. Thanks, and nice to see you again, and meet you on the Zoom. I'm Jeff, I'm thrilled to hear that you're asking about capacity, and might I propose there might be something, just getting tiny bit political right now, there might be something that the town of Canmore Council might do to basically appeal to the province for support on this critical issue. We've lost a good person and a good soldier and worker bee and Jay Honeyman, and the situation requires his replacement, and that is a provincial opportunity. So I suppose let's keep our eye on that. That is a ginormous area, as you said, Jeff, and it's a massive capacity issue for Brett and good staff like that. So, Brett, I wanted to zoom in on something that you asked, that you kind of proposed, and so it's I had the pleasure, as other people may have, of sitting in on a presentation by the Yellowstone to Yukon just like 2 weeks ago, that in essence talked about the Bow Valley cumulative effects using grizzly bears as a model, and basically I actually have a link. I can drop that into the chat in a second here. But anyway, it shows that recreation is arguably a more significant impact on wildlife than even full development build out. And that was a surprise to me. But I trust the science involved, and it just sort of underlines for me the importance of dealing with this recreation. So, Brett, thanks for kind of throwing out the possibility that EARC, this ERC committee, might somehow get involved with that. And one of the various there's a variety of different fora, I suppose, to kind of consider the impact of recreation on wildlife and so on. One potential is, and I got two questions that I'm getting to, so pardon the long preamble here, but this roundtable on human wildlife coexistence is possibly and theoretically a group that could consistently, and I think the present times call for a greater scrutiny on this recreation question. And so I guess the two questions I would have, I'll just put out there is could that roundtable include recreation impacts in a more substantial manner than it has? Because it was a 2018, 17-18 report that, if I remember correctly, that came out. And also there's a technical committee that our organization used to sit on, and I've lost track. Well, I happen to know that we're not currently viewed as being kind of on that technical committee, but we had groups like Y2Y and CPAW, Southern Alberta, and Biosphere sitting on the technical committee. And it's my view that we could bring resources and we can bring kind of our good thinking to that conversation if invited. So those are my two questions about, could the roundtable deal with recreation in a more substantial manner? And in your view, I suppose, should NGOs like Yellowstone to Yukon and perhaps our organization too also be part of the conversation? Thanks.
Yeah, so that's an interest. The first question I find is interesting, and John, I'll say my 2 bits, and then maybe you can weigh in too, just because you sat on that. And I say it's interesting, Gareth, in the standpoint of, yes, you could have that conversation. However, I think if you were to go back to the recommendations, it largely did speak to recreation and or other uses without specifically naming recreation. So I guess it depends on whether or not we need to say we shouldn't have people in all the corridors versus saying we shouldn't have recreation in all the corridors, because it did talk about, habitat security of the corridors. So it did speak to that within the recommendations, admittedly not specifically to a type of group. And as I recall, we did that specifically as so not to focus, because what's the difference between a mountain biker going in the corridor versus a commercial dog sled operation? I guess they're both kind of recreation. One's commercial and one's just there for because they like to recreate. So I think to that it could be. And in terms, should other environmental agencies be involved in the technical group? I think absolutely. I guess once we find out what that terms of reference for that technical group is. So maybe it involves groups such as yourselves, or maybe it involves more. So I guess I don't have clear understanding of how that technical group and then the terms of reference for that will be operating going forward. Supposedly it's being worked on. I'm just not privy to all those conversations.
Yeah, and Gareth, I'll just add that since the dissolution of the technical working group, when WildSmart was a part of it, there has not been, I don't believe there's been another working group meeting, or maybe there was a quick roundtable, but there's been meetings of the coexistence roundtable, which are all the higher up government folks, but the working group, that Brett and I were involved, has not really moved forward on any projects since we pressed,
Yeah.
published on the report.
So, a very fast, thanks to both of you for that. And Brett, if it's possible, I wouldn't mind following up with you on that. In my view, there's a bunch of conversations that could and should happen that involve recreation and wildlife. And I think that my own perspective is, having looked at the various fora, that roundtable conversation is the right level, the right players at the table. It's where the conversation should take place, in my view, because it's the provinces at the table, and this is a key responsibility for the province. But if I'm wrong there, like, I stand to be corrected on a better venue, better kind of fora or venue. But that's my current thinking on the best place to have that conversation is the roundtable.
I guess I have one question for the group, because myself, I'm not involved, but I do believe that the Canmore Area Trails Plan, CATS or something, I don't know if it's plan, is currently meeting fairly regularly right now to figure out where trails could be or should be within the Bow Valley. I don't know if it would be, I think it's appropriate for like a place like the Roundtable Coexistence to meet and talk about what that might mean, but it might also mean it would be worthwhile for this group or others to engage with Canmore Area Trails. I can't remember what the whole acronym stands for.
Canmore Area Trail Strategy, and it's
strategy. Thank you.
We've been talking about it for years, but it hasn't really gotten off the ground. But
Okay.
there's some support and funding to move that forward, and engaging recreational groups and conservation groups that would be part of that, as well as the public.
Perfect. Thank you, John. And so, yeah, so that's where, and I think it'd be really appropriate to engage with that group. And my only, having been involved in very polarizing discussions, is that anything you can enter and just recognize that they're more collaborative and cooperative to achieving and sharing outcomes and principles for achieving those outcomes, I think will lead to better outcomes for all involved.
And thanks. I'll go away now, but I just want to say that this is not, we've heard a lot of, hey, somebody could and should be doing this, but it's not. We've heard that on a couple of different fronts, and there's a wonderful opportunity for some leadership, Brett, by the province to step into this kind of significant gap and fill it with some really good process that encourages the collaboration you just spoke of. Thanks.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions for our guests? Well, thanks, Brett and John, for this presentation. I think it's been very helpful. We haven't we've had the town involved in our meetings, and you're the first external people to present, and really appreciate your input, and gives us lots of food for thought.
Sure. Thank you very much, Bob, and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Brett and John, for joining us today.
I'll be leaving now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't even know ERC existed until a couple days ago, and someone said, "Are you going to the ERC meeting?" And I was like, "What's that?" And then Brett indicated he was doing a presentation, so I was like, "Can I join in?" So I really didn't put any input to that, but I do live and work in Canmore here, and the human wildlife coexistence part is sort of near and dear to my heart, and I ply my trade in Kananaskis country. Is it okay if I linger and hang out with you guys for a little bit?
Absolutely, John. It's nice to have your input here, and the committee here. What we want to do is try to move the goalposts here, because we see a lot of conflict with wildlife in the valley, and we don't see a lot of change over the last few years. And we're hoping to maybe, by discussing this more openly and engaging town council and the community, that we can have a more positive outcome than we've had in the last couple of years.
And so, hey, Bob, if I may, given that, you know, John it's a fabulous, we're so lucky to have John. And John, we are a committee of the town of Canmore. There's a bunch of really keen people who care on the call here, and it's my privilege to be part of it as a sort of kind of an ex officio member representing Biosphere Institute. And do you have any information, any advice for us on how we can help, as Bob said, you know, kind of move the goalposts or kind of move the needle indeed on the situation? I've tried to flag, like, hey, what about this? Waverly flagged, hey, you know, this, like, there's holes in the frickin' fence. What about that? So, you know, any advice you have on what we might do as a citizen committee with a good connection to the council, I think would be more than welcome.
Yeah, like, I mean, I would love to see the reformation of that human wildlife coexistence working group. And that was, you know, Brett and Jay and a bunch of us who were actually doing the technical work, looking at the data and moving it forward. There's a lot of upper level approval saying, yeah, we want to do this, but no, we don't get our marching orders. You know, we'll call us the foot soldiers down below to go out and do things. So when Jeff asked the question, you know, what's the plan for the highway? Well, if we had the coexistence working group, that would be one of my first steps, is come up with a plan for the highway. And I've worked with university groups who come out for the week, and I say, hey, fix this. And they go out and they look at the highway and they draw maps, and then they go, wow, this is really complicated. It's not really that easy. But, you know, that would be a great challenge to address, whether it's reducing speed limits and fencing or a combination thereof. At least get from the Banff Gate to the Bow River fixed up, and then we're
Absolutely
piecing together the rest of the valley. But you need someone to be saying, that's, you know, let's get on that. And that's where I think maybe in this working group, Gareth, does WildSmart need to be at the table, you know, to discuss the engineering possibilities for the highway? Maybe in the communication part of it, but maybe not. And the worry is, you know, Three Sisters wants to be involved and Stone Creek wants to be involved. You get a group of 28 people, and sometimes the subject matter doesn't apply to everyone. So I think a smaller group with invited participants and make sure we include everyone at certain times would be the way to move that forward. Maybe.
Another interesting challenge is this recreation stuff that we just finished talking about, right? Like how does that play out in the best possible way?
Yeah, and that's one of the recommendations. I mean, I look at this thing, you know, several times a week, is reduce the human footprint in wildlife corridors. That's, you know, is an overarching way to move forward. What a great idea. Let's get on that. How do we do that? Well, and that's where you sort of have to you need people on the ground going over this trail by trail by trail, and educating, but also doing, you know, physical on the ground, removing some of those trails. And that's where we're at. That's what needs to happen.
So just
John, I also feel that go ahead, Caitlin.
No, go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say that the town of Canmore has a role to play in that, John, because we're the source of a lot of those recreationists.
Absolutely. Like, that's the key player at the table, I think. I have a lot of ideas for what could happen in the next phase of this, and it would take up this, and I'm not really prepared to put those on the table right now, but I think there's a lot more ways that the town of Canmore could be engaged in a productive manner and in a collaborative manner as well.
And
I'll just mention as a point of process, the mayor of Canmore and I are meeting with Rob Simmerich, who is the guy who kind of is running that roundtable process. And we have a meeting on the 27th of June just to kind of noodle about possibilities and hopefully get some things happening.
Oh, great. Yeah, and Rob's not my supervisor. Like I said, I'm the parks guy. Rob is, you know, the guy who's all of the stuff that Brett is looking at too. So I have a small thing, but I'm living here and engaged, and I'm pretty familiar with the issues here. I've been here for 30 years, so I'd love to be involved.
And John, it sounds like maybe you just scratched the surface of a bigger conversation that we could maybe have with you at a later date. be, I think, valuable for the committee to have you as a resource for maybe some future meetings.
Yeah, no, I'm always interested in this kind of stuff, especially as, you know, the environmental components of Canmore, because not only is it something that I've, you know, spent my life working on, but I live here in Canmore. So if you let me, I'll come back.
Be careful what you wish for. Okay, there's no further questions for John.
I just had a question for you, John. Or not a question, but more an observation. I think going to a smaller group, you're much further ahead. I've been involved with strategic planning in my career, and we are trying to do consultation with all the interest groups, and it takes forever and ever and ever to get anything done. So if you keep your circle tight, you're much further ahead. You can get a lot more accomplished, and then you can go out to the larger group.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I totally agree, Ken. It's like, it's nice to include everyone all the time, but once you're in your 5th meeting of 28 people, it's hard to schedule, hard to manage, hard to get through. Keep it tight when you need to consult with certain people, bring them on board.
Yeah. Now, when you start getting all these other group individuals, they all have specific interests, and they start pulling you every which direction. So I think the idea of a small group is certainly the direction I think you should be going.
Agreed.
Nick,
Yes,
your
Nick.
hand was up earlier there.
Yeah, no, I just was gonna say, hi everyone, and so I had kids running in the background. I'm at home, so that's why my screen was off. But it was a great presentation by Brett. Thanks, John, as well for your insight. I just wanted to let the committee here know that the wonderful mind of John P. is on our Wild Smart Advisory Committee as well. So I do speak with John on a regular basis. You know, we both did the same interviews today with Global, so we do chat regularly. So he is an excellent resource to have on your team. So I just wanted to mention that. And one quick question, John, have you guys talked within the AEP about hazing elk out of town and getting rid of them like they do in Banff? Because it just came up in the interview as well today with Global. He was asking about that. And I was like, I can't comment on that, sorry.
Yeah, you know, and sorry, I don't want to eat up too much time here, but basically I go for a walk down, I'm just by the river, and I take my hiking pole with a bit of flagging tape. You run into an elk and you get that flagging up at least 8-9 feet in the air, and the elk freak out and lose their minds and run away. Could we encourage the citizenry of Canmore to do that? You'd probably save a lot on a lot of those, you know, conflicts. Are we prepared to empower people to do that? I'm not sure, but in Banff they have a group of people who sweep the town in the morning, and that's all they use is a stick and a flag and a couple little bits of tin to make some noise. It's not like you're pushing a grizzly bear. So there are, you know, there's things we could try and move through. I was talking with Mark Hoskin about that too, and he's like, yeah, maybe that could work. Or have a couple environmental technicians around Canmore for the summer, hire a couple kids to move the elk out in the morning. And yeah, so sorry, that's a longer conversation too, but I think there's a lot of interesting options.
Yeah, cool, thanks. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were on that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, are we ready to move on to item E?
No, I think there's 2 more questions there,
I'm
Bob.
sorry.
Glynis and Jeff both have one. Glynis?
Yeah, I just was thinking about some of the things we've talked about tonight and we've been asked earlier on, is there a way of kind of coordinating or getting different environmental groups together? It sounds like there is a need for more transparency in other efforts as well. I've opened up the open space and trails plan from the town, which was amended in August of 2021. And then tonight we were hearing about the Canmore area trails strategy. So there might be a role for ERC in helping understand layout and to the town, perhaps, to coordinate some of these initiatives and make sure that it isn't just mountain bikers inputting to the trail strategy, that there's also wildlife specialists and that type of thing involved.
And part of that CATS process will be to engage the public in a open consultation and forums and get everyone to the table, like anyone who wants to provide input there, and then also have those groups, specialized groups involved as well.
And who's the leader? Who's running that? The owner of that process?
It's early in the game. I would say, well, I don't want to rat him out because I might be wrong.
Organization, if not a person.
Alberta Environment and Parks Operations Division. I think it's Dwayne Fieser has been the champion of that so far, but I'm not sure he'll be the one rolling it out. But there's funding and a commitment to see that process to fruition.
Cool. Okay, thanks.
And I just figured just ask a question to John while we have the expert in the room. How many grizzly bears we got in the valley right now that we're dealing with in Canmore? It feels like more than 10. It's like,
well, I said today 9 in my or 10 in my media interview, and that's the ones I know for sure. That I can sort of say, okay, I've got these 3 on camera. There's a collared grizzly bear right by the RCMP station this morning. And it's kind of cool. I found her tracks. She's using if you drive along the 1A where the railway bridge, she went under the bridge there this morning. She's come into town a few times hunting calves. She's been as far as the sewage treatment plant. It's a family group of 3. She's been seen once, and she's been in the valley. It'll be 2 months tomorrow. And then we have these other sub-adult bears that are running around. One came down my back, was almost on Main Street the other night. They're probably younger, pushing the limits. There's a female and cub down at the East Gate. So I can say, 9 in the last week, I know 100% for sure. I'm sure there's a bunch of wary ones. And the only reason I know about the other 3 is a GPS collar. But right now there's snow in the mountains. The river valley is flooding. So they're kind of in a habitat sandwich here where they're picking all the good stuff. It's the same place that we like to be. Especially
I know you can't predict the weather and then when the snowpack's going to start to diminish. I think we got another 2-3 weeks of this, 4 weeks before they kind of decide to go to other places.
Yeah, when sort of what I was driving through a foot of snow a week ago, the last Tuesday up in Lougheed, Lougheed Park. But the problem with that is all that snow was hitting all the flowering buffalo berry that was just going into flower up here. And the Canmore, it's setting up to be an okay buffalo berry season, but that probably not annihilated, but really it really dampens the buffalo berry production. I think I'm saying we're 3 weeks behind. Usually by Canada Day, we've got ripe buffalo berries in Canmore, and it's not going to be till at least mid-July until it gets good here. So it's a weird sort of temporal shift for us.
Right.
I'm nervous for those bears in the interim.
Yes. I was just kind of curious because sometimes you ask me, how long do you think they're going to be sticking around for? And I was like, I'm not exactly sure. Because when you say how the incentive to go up high, buffalo berry crops been kind of wiped out. You think they're going to be here all summer? Ugh.
No, I think, I've seen the one collared family group that's here. They've sort of gone up Wind Valley a couple times and they venture up to Columbola or something, and then they come down. So they're digging. The other thing is the elk, our urban elk situation provides a great food source for the grizzly bears, and we've seen those grizzly bears coming in actively chasing, and I'm dying to get into some of these habitat patches here on the edge of town, but the bears keep going in there just to see if I can find the remnants and that of those little elk calves, because that's takeaway food. They grab a newborn calf which is defenseless, and they get out of there, and that's going to have implications for our future elk population too. I think I didn't want to argue with Brett, but I think we've tried to do a few surveys this fall, and I think our elk numbers are down over the last 15 years. We used to be up around 200, and I bet you we're below 100. And there's this new hepatic disease.
Wow.
Yeah, well, around 100. I'm guessing. I'd say maybe 120, but there's a new hepatic disease that showed up in Banff, and then we've seen a few elk go down here in Canmore in the last couple of weeks, where they're healthy 1 second, and 12 hours later they're dead, and it's a liver-borne disease that I don't know enough about. But Banff has lost quite a few elk just this spring, and we've seen it happen here too. So it could be a real dynamic changer for for the valley.
Thank you. That's super insightful, and yeah, thanks for sharing.
No worries.
So that really shows that it's quite a behavior change within the elk population if the numbers are decreasing, but the encounters or conflicts are increasing.
And sorry, I feel guilty taking up so much time, but it used to be I could go out here and count. I think the biggest herd I counted was 170 elk in the spring, and that was maybe 10, 12 years ago. And I'm really having a hard time finding a group of more than 30 here in town. I think I saw 60 a while back, but those big herds that were in the Palliser lands for one, or the Canmore Golf Course, they're not aggregating like that, and we need to open up more habitat. We're losing habitat on the hillsides because of conifers incursion. We're eating up habitat in town because we're developing land. So we need to have fires and open up habitat, and that will be the one thing that really changes the dynamic for elk and other animals too, getting that habitat, because the forests around here are just a green desert when it comes to wildlife.
John, just a follow up on your question, or not question, but your comment on spruce invading habitat. Excuse me. And what I'm thinking about is fuel management. We've talked about this as a committee, but I'm wondering at the value of the fuel habitat. Maybe it needs to go further up the hill to manage that habitat up the hill. Is that a benefit for wildlife, grizzlies, elk, so on and so forth? Because, you know, my experience, 45 years in forestry, and working with wildlife habitat and biologists and stuff like that, I've seen that happen, and I'm wondering if that would be a benefit here.
Oh yeah, like my dream would be to have the Douglas fir savanna all across Lady Mac with 80-90% of those trees gone. If you look at some of the historical Georgetown photos that they took from the town site, and that was just over 100 years ago, Lady Mac is kind of open, you know, it's mostly open habitat with hardly any trees, and now it's solid trees, and that's creeping right up into sheep habitat. It's diminishing elk habitat. The buffalo berry production, once you get a canopy that's a certain density, buffalo berries don't grow there anymore. So it is like the green desert for wildlife. And when the big fire comes through, if we have a big forest, it's going to burn. So I think doing forest management is really important, not only to save Canmore, but to maintain wildlife.
One of the things I'm just wondering about as well, maybe Caitlin and Bob, maybe invite John along if we go on that field trip to look at the wildlife, or not the wildlife, but the fire management strategies that are around town. And maybe John could speak a little bit about the benefits of that from a wildlife habitat perspective.
Yeah, the thing is, the town is just doing the fire smarting in town. There is a committee that's underway right now when we're developing the Bow Valley Wildfire and Vegetation Management Strategy for the next 20 years, and Carrie Martins from the town is involved in that, but and others. And it's that same study area that Brett showed, the Bow Valley, well, basically from the Banff Park boundary to the Kananaskis River. So, you know, we're talking thousands of hectares that need to go. The wild card in all of this is the pine beetle. And we've been averaging 4,000 to 7,000 pine beetle trees a year. And we've had a few cold snaps in the winter, but maybe this is the year where that becomes 50,000 trees get hit, and then that becomes almost unmanageable, and 50,000 becomes 1 million. And maybe that'll take care of all the habitat problems for us. So I'm like team pine beetle.
It sounds like a plan, but go to BC. I dealt with pine beetle for 15 years. So.
I was doing surveys in 1991 when we were going to nip the problem in the bud. So, but it's changed. Like, you go to Jasper now and you go, oh my God, what a catastrophe, but it's great for wildlife and for habitat.
Yeah. No, the reason I was talking about, see if you could join us, is just, you know, maybe a small area, but it was beneficial, the benefit for wildlife. That's what I'm thinking about.
For sure.
And looking at the long-term proposal that you're talking about would be a value.
Sure, and I'm happy to do this as a private citizen too, or in my work role too. It doesn't matter. I'm just, this stuff turns me on, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, you're muted.
if I can just editorialize, like we've got the greenest council I've ever seen in this town, and a committee that's just killing it. Like you guys, the EARC is doing wonderful work, and I have to think there must be an opportunity. Jeff, I welcome your comment on this, but really to kind of for this council to reach out with a message for the province saying, hey, we could use a little help over here. We're trying to get some stuff done.
We try to reach out a lot of times. It kind of hits a bit of like a wall. Like case in point when John was talking about pine beetle stuff. There's this whole thing that the Mayor Crouser was trying to deal with, trying to get a grant to deal with dealing with more pine beetle trees, et cetera, et cetera, et cether. And there's like the way the grants were timed, they didn't quite align. And at the end of the day, it all kind of fell for the crapper. And then it's just like, yeah, you kind of hit the bureaucratic thing yet on that point. But definitely this council's motivated for stuff. And like case in point, the part you said earlier about, we do need a resource to fill the shoes of like the vacancy of Jay Honeyman. And that could be a great thing that we could also bring forth too. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not officially suggesting this in any capacity, but there are opportunities where the town could fund positions like a conservation officer or such that would be stationed within the Canmore area. I see, John, you kind of gave a little eye roll almost to that one. So I'm curious your thoughts on that, because I have heard there's potential to have partnerships in that way.
And maybe I see the opportunity to have some staff, summer staff, even students to deal with fruit trees, deal with elk, deal with rabbits, and pet peeve of mine. And I might be speaking. I'm John from Canmore now. I'm not my government guy. My work day's over. But the rabbit funding. I mean, I see the $50,000 going to remove rabbits, and I'm like, a couple of kids and some wire could fix up half the rabbit problems in town in a summer for $10,000. Let's redeploy that money and sort of have some boots on the ground that are helping the Fish and Wildlife Officer put up some of these warning signs and post the elk warning signs. Because I Mark Hoskins calls me the other morning to run down, staple up a few signs here and there. So I think there's some great opportunities for the town to have some light level engagement. Okay, I'm back. I'm John from the government now. Part was just John the taxpayer was just speaking there.
No, well, that's a different way to think about potentially partnering through summer student programs. There might be potential there somewhere. Sorry, Nick.
Can I jump in? I was just going to say along those lines, and there's been discussions also with your predecessor, Lori, getting volunteers to help with removing fruit. And it's kind of, there's a good and a bad there. The bad is that people are lazy and they need to take care of their own fruit, right? Like you can't do everything for them and clean up their garbage for them. Like people need to be held accountable. But on the other side, there are people that just physically can't or aren't able. And so it has been discussed. One way the town could, I think, get involved quite easily would be if they say, just like FCSS manages the Snow Angels, where people volunteer to shovel the driveway of the elderly or the injured, having a similar thing where the volunteers are kind of managed or run through the town, like administratively or legally, however you want to put it, but then have volunteers that could do things like fruit removal or like from trees. And there's obviously some of the liabilities there, but that's one, I think, fairly simple, because going to shovel a driveway is not that much different than going to pick up fruit off the ground in someone's backyard. It's very similar. So that's one way. And potentially, like John was saying, the elk thing or helping put up signs, students, they need to do volunteer stuff for school. That could be some easy, low-hanging fruit ways that that volunteers could be utilized. No pun intended, partially.
Yeah, Nick, and I just grimace at that a little bit, sorry, because a friend of mine who had a beautiful crabapple tree, 4 of us picked for hours and hours, and we picked 12 5-gallon pails, couldn't get to the top of the tree. I mean, it's a lot more than shoveling a driveway, and most of those trees are flagged as an issue after a bear's already been in there. And there's only so many palatable crab apples in town. So the pin cherries nobody wants, the mountain ash nobody wants, and we tried to do this in Prince George. We had a group of 9 summer students, and we did 27 trees in several weeks with 9 students, and that was a big win. And we've got 2,600 trees here in town. I kind of think we've got to sort of say, bring those trees down. Sorry.
Agree. No, I would rather that too, because I spent years doing promo, for public education, removing fruit from trees year after year at the Grizzly Paw. And yeah, it's great for education purposes, but not 10 years in a row. And at a certain point, yeah, enough is enough. But if we don't get to the point where trees are mandatory to get rid of, then at least that's one way to get volunteers involved for sure. But we've got that volunteer fruit tree removal program, and $300 towards a big tree isn't that much. So for residents, in terms of an incentive, and we need to make the incentive more like what's best for the wildlife, not monetary incentive. But that's a whole other ball game that we're talking about there. But I agree, John. Yes, I mean, removing the trees is by far the easier and best long-term solution.
And we had a Wild Smart Lake committee in Prince George, and we removed the 26 trees. We were proud. This was 1999. For Y2K, the town's works people planted 2,000 crabapple trees in the town. We were like, oh, just give up. So sorry.
Oh, perfect, Bob. Should we
Okay,
move
Are
along?
we ready to move on? Okay, so we'll move on to updates. And Jeff, do you have anything from the council to?
On the council side, nothing really too much. That 800 Canmore, the palliative care proposal development thing, we are supposed to take a look at that first Tuesday of July. We'll see what goes on with that. That might be bumped out a little bit further if the applicant needs more time to work with their stuff. As you all saw, we as a council a couple of Tuesdays ago, we decided to appeal the LPRT decision. And so that is our legal counsel is kind of chugging away with those pieces. And eventually that next step will be going to Court of Appeal and seeing if there are grounds for appeal. And if there's yes, and then, we kick it off into the next cycle. So I think that was the big thing there. And yeah, that's kind of about it for council stuff with regards to environmental things I can see at the current moment. Yeah. Oh yeah, that thing, Canada Day Parade coming up. I think there's probably going to be lots of people around. So like if there's lots of bears around at the same time there's lots of people, it can make for a little bit of an exciting weekend. Just giving you a heads up. John, you probably noticed, but if not, it's like Banff is not having a parade this year. And so it could be double capacity for this year's parade. So lots more folks, probably fireworks again. So that'll be going on as well too. And yeah, so that's what's happening on that end. So expect this Canada Day long weekend coming up, lots of people around, which could be interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it for council updates I can think of right now for environmental stuff. Mm-hmm. Questions?
Thanks, Jeff. I'll just mention that following the parade, there is a gathering at the Stan Rogers and Biosphere will have and WildSmart, in fact, will have a booth there, and as will others.
Thanks. You guys in the parade too? You guys got a float? Oh, good.
Not a float.
Not a float.
With a simple sign. Don't control expectations here. We will be walking. We'll have a sign if we get it from the printer in time.
Okay, awesome.
I will have bear spray though, so if bears do show up, we're prepared.
Okay.
Okay, I'll just open it up to everybody if anybody has any other updates for the round table, we'll just put up your hand and we'll just go that way. Okay, awfully quiet bunch tonight.
Bob, I am putting up my hand, and I think Ken and I would both possibly, I don't want to speak for Ken, but we're interested in this kind of the tour of the wild smarting, the fire smarting area in town.
Right, so I'm just wondering if anybody else is interested, and if so, maybe we can ask Caitlin to arrange a tour. And I guess we just need to find out who's interested. And then, of course, we probably need to know what the availability of whoever would be taking us around as well.
I imagine that would probably happen in the fall, is my gut feeling, just with like the intensity of work going on for EMS and fire services for the summer. It's traditionally a pretty busy time. And I know, I think I'm speaking for myself, like I'll probably be away a bunch of time during the summer, etc. So I wonder if it's a tricky time, maybe September.
That might be a reasonable idea,
Mhm.
Councillor Ma, and I can go back to Carrie Martins. She agreed that she would be willing to do this, to suggest or get her to propose some dates in the fall that might work for her toward the group, if everyone agrees. I just wanted to check that we're all on the same page before I booked her in on for anything.
Yep.
Is there, I guess my second follow-up to that is this something we want to do during a regular ERC meeting, or do you want to do this outside of an ERC meeting? Keeping in mind that Carrie probably works 9 to 5 type of hours.
I don't think it has to be in a meeting time slot. Perhaps maybe you identify a couple of key participants and try to find availability, and then let the rest of us know. I'd be interested, but I'm not a key participant.
Yeah, and I'm flexible for whatever everybody else decides. Obviously, we have people here that have real jobs, and some of us are retired and are a little more flexible.
There's some great examples of fire smarting, the good, the bad, just in the downtown core near the skating pond and down by the engine bridge. And if you were to leave, the civic center, you could probably do an hour walk and get a glimpse of what's happening out there.
There was a good one up at the bench line where I had to look up with.
Yeah.
That's a really good one.
And what they did in part.
You see the diversity in land ownership as well as good strategies.
Out of your purview, but what they did in Harvey Heights last year was pretty impressive too.
Haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, that's quite something.
But I just think it would be a good idea for people to see exactly how it works and, the impacts to wildlife, the benefits to them, and, how it actually works. Right? If they're not familiar with it, I am, but I find it always very interesting.
Okay, well, I'll reach out to Carrie Martins to see if she can give me a few dates that might work for her and times, and then I'll do a doodle poll or something, and this group can vote on which dates and times work best for everyone. And I'll try to see if we can do a range of early morning, later in the afternoon for people that work the typical 9 to 5.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Hey, Bob, I'll just mention while we're doing the roundtable, inspired by, I really was inspired by this group's purview of the gondola proposal and your thoughtful analysis of the terms of reference for the environmental impact assessment. So our organization doesn't normally weigh in. We're not an advocacy group, but we do believe in best available science. So commenting on those terms of reference made a lot of sense for us. So we did that, and I played it through. My board saw it and went out. And I'm just you guys need to know that activity was inspiring for me and no doubt others. And I know that there's several other groups in town that submitted letters and so on and so forth. So anyway, thanks for the inspiration.
Well, thanks, Gareth. It's nice to have your perspective from where you sit in the valley right now as well, as to how we appear as a committee or how we work as a committee. So it's encouraging.
You're killing it.
Yeah, and Gareth, I really appreciate it when you send around those reminders of various things going on. It's hard to catch them all, and that was appreciated.
You're welcome.
Okay, if we can, we'll move on to new business. And the one item of new business that I would like to talk about is carrying carrying this wildlife management issue a little further while the summer's, while we're in recess for the summer. And I would like to ask if Gareth and Nick would be interested in joining me on maybe a subcommittee, or anybody else who's interested, so we can keep this initiative moving during the summer, with the idea of maybe we will have something to present to council, maybe either August or September. Thoughts, anybody?
Happy to do that.
Great. Anybody else want to join this venture during the summer? I know people are really busy. Okay, Ken, great. We'll maybe what we'll do, Gareth, is get some common times to get together in the next few weeks, just to keep the fires burning, so to speak.
Fires.
And we might be using some of John's expertise along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Can I
Bob,
just,
if you don't mind circulating that, sorry, depending on availability.
Sure.
yeah, I think it would make sense to circulate anything to the group before it gets sent off, just because it does come from ERC. So, but also my train of thought, it just went, but I was going to say, yes, take a look at the bylaw, the ERC bylaw, and make sure that you're presenting any recommendations to council under the context of which you are governed. So I know there is a line under there about mitigating something about the environmental policies. So I think that's where this would fall under.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just make it very clear to council that as per our bylaw, we can provide advice on XYZ. We are coming forward as a delegation on this, and just make sure that's very clear, and we follow proper process. And then when you're ready, you can circulate to me, and I'll talk internally about how best to bring that forward and when's a good meeting. I know council's pretty busy, as Councillor Ma can probably attest to. So we want to make sure we find a good meeting.
Yeah, we'll definitely, whatever happens in the summer, I think if anything does develop, the committee will be informed through emails, and of course, with whoever wants to participate is welcome as well, depending on their availability. But I just don't want to, I think we've got some good momentum going since we started this initiative, and I just don't want to see it die off. I want to build it up as opposed to flatten out or take a step backwards.
Okay. And just for my notes, it's the members of the Biosphere, Bob and Ken, would be participating on that subcommittee.
With Waverly as a potential additional as well, based on availability.
Yeah. What are you calling this subcommittee? Just curious.
Pardon me?
What will you call this subcommittee?
Well, you look like you've got some ideas, so.
All right.
I just put in the meeting notes right now as wildlife subcommittee. You can come up with a fancier name once you meet, and you can let us know if you want.
Or should it be the people management subcommittee? Because they're trying to manage people, not wildlife.
If that's what you want to call yourselves.
And so what we're looking for is leadership on wildlife management. And so that might be the name of it, possibly.
Okay.
I would love to join you guys. I'm not sure if I can do it officially or just as Sean, the taxpayer from Canmore, but it seems like an exciting group, and I'm happy to try and support you any way I can. Yeah.
That would be great, John.
Yeah, and Bob, I don't have any bandwidth in the next month or so, but later on, if there's if I can add value later in August, I could do that.
Yeah, I think what we'll try to do is,
Bring it back to the
as we move along, I think we'll try to provide at least some updates to the committee if there's any significant progress that we're making during the summer. We'll try and give updates as we go. Is there any other new business? If not, then let's look to scheduling our next meeting. I believe we'll typically we don't meet in this July and August, so I guess we're looking towards September now.
And Bob, just on other business, I think that only other thing was that cigarette butt thing that was mostly just looking for the town to come back about any initiatives that have happened or maybe in the works, if that's okay.
I'll make a note that that was the intention. I thought I had it down as a future meeting discussion, but I'll reach out to Parks to see if they have any, or Waste Management, if they have any programs for cigarette butts.
Yeah, I think it was as future discussion, but probably the base of that discussion would be knowing what's happened or what's in the works. We could go from there.
Caitlin, do you have a calendar up for us for the for September?
Just pulling it up here. So we meet, is it typically, we got off schedule when we had the late May and then the late June meeting, but I think we're typically the first Tuesday or first Monday of the month, right?
Yes, but in September, that's Labor Day.
Yeah.
So that's a good point. So this is the 12th, September 12th.
I think so, yeah. 12th or the 19th.
Yeah, and that may fluctuate or change depending on the tour as well. Or it could be flexible, but
I have no, not a barrier, but I do have a board meeting on the 12th with my board, 3 to 6 p.m.
so the 19th. Anyone
good then.
opposed to September 19th?
Works.
I'll write it in the meetings minutes.
And John, is there a way to get your contact info for the summer?
Sure, yeah, I'm likewise, I'm sort of booked till August, but I'll just put my email in the chat. That's probably the best way.
Thanks.
I'll send out a placeholder meeting invite for the 19th, and as we get closer to that, we can explore in person or online, depending on how things are going then. The other thing I just want to touch base on, as I'm not totally familiar on the process, everyone on this group just signed on for the beginning of their 2-year term. Is it
Except for me.
is there like a new intake or a changeover in membership in the fall?
Ralph, Glynis, and Ken and I are all older members.
Thank
Going
you
of
for
seniors.
wording
I
that
didn't
so
mean it that
nicely.
way.
Still there.
But if the shoe fits.
And so what has typically been your process? Is this reviewed annually, or is it?
I think
Sorry, go ahead, Bob.
what I was going to say is that we usually get informed that our term is expiring and that we have to reapply. So that usually comes out in the fall.
Okay. No, that's good. I just wanted to touch base on that. So I'll look into that again for the fall.
And there was usually a posting for that as well that was circulated. So
Yeah, it'll end up in the paper in the Rocky Mountain Outlook under Town of Canmore.
Okay. No, thank you for that. I didn't have that background, so I appreciate it.
Great.
There's no limit to how many terms you can do, is there? In the bylaws for ERC?
My understanding is there isn't, but you just have
Great.
to keep reapplying.
Okay, fine. All right. Sounds like a formality in some ways, perhaps. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Let's check.
Bob, do we just put our names forward if we want to extend our term?
Yeah, it'll come in the fall. There'll be an actual, you should get an email saying that your term is expiring.
Mhm.
And if you want to reapply, That's usually how it's been working in the
Okay,
past.
we send him right up again and everything else, or how does that?
You can probably say as per my last resume, maybe.
Okay,
Should be my file.
fair enough.
I'll look into those
What?
details.
I
on-
applied fresh every time. New
No, the
resume.
webs-
You're special, Ralph.
The website says late August, the applications will be open.
Okay. Okay. I'll check internally on how that process works for the town and who leads that. I'm guessing it's probably me, so I should probably figure it out. But I'll get back to you all.
And Caitlin, maybe you could just find out who's up for renewal this year as well.
Yep.
Thanks. Okay, there's nothing else. I guess I'm going to ask for a motion to adjourn. Thanks,
So
Glynis.
moved.
Okay. Well, we'll stay in touch over the summer and see everybody in the fall.
Thanks so much, John, Gareth. Thanks
Yeah,
so much.
everybody.
Everyone, take care.
Good summer.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye,
Have a
everybody.
good summer.
Take care.
Summer. Bye.
I'll be line if you need anything.